James Whitewater killed 2 men. While in prison from 1872 to 1889, he embraced Christianity. In 1889, the Nebraska legislature passed an act allowing the governor to pardon 2 inmates who had been in jail more than 10 years or whose conduct while incarcerated merited such mercy. Albert Johnson arrived at the Nebraska State Prison sporting an impressive handlebar mustache. Johnson was sentenced to 1 year and 6 months for grand larceny. Because of prison policy to reduce lice, authorities shaved Johnson's head and facial hair. Detailed descriptions and mugshots were important to police and prison authorities. Criminals easily changed names and created numerous identities. Typically, 3 mugshots were taken of each prisoner. Smiling faces in Victorian-era photographs are rare. George H. Ray grinning in a prison mugshot is truly unusual. Ray served 10 years for manslaughter in the late 1890s. People rarely smiled in 19th-century photographs. Long exposure times are often blamed for the lack of happy faces. By the end of the 19th century, advances in photographic technology reduced exposures to seconds, but having a photograph taken by a professional remained a serious and sometimes sober occasion. James Collins was arrested in Omaha on May 12, 1897, for burglary. In his mugshot, Collins' head has been bandaged. According to the police record, Collins escaped and was rearrested. The 23-year-old Omaha tailor was sent to the Nebraska State Prison on March 19, 1898, to serve a 5-year sentence. Goldie Williams defiantly crossed her arms for her Omaha Police Court mugshot, arrested for vagrancy on Jan. 29, 1898. Williams, also known as Meg Murphy, stood only 5 feet tall and weighed 110 pounds, according to police records. She listed her home as Chicago and her occupation as prostitute. According to her arrest descriptions, her left index finger was broken and she had a cut below her right wrist. Williams sports an elaborate hat with satin ribbons and feathers. She also wears large hoop earrings. 3 burglars blew up a safe in a bank vault in Sheridan, Missouri on the night of Feb. 15, 1898. They got away with about $2,400. The bank's insurance company hired the famed Pinkerton Detective Agency and sent Assistant Superintendent F.H. Tolotson to hunt down the burglars. Tolotson tracked one of the wanted men through Missouri to Council Bluffs and eventually to a room at the Sheridan Hotel in Omaha. With the aid of the Omaha police, Tolotson apprehended a gun-wielding fugitive after a brief struggle. The alleged bank robber gave his name as Charles Martin, but had several letters addressed to Charles Davis. Martin was unknown to Omaha police, but some detectives speculated to newspaper reporters he could be the notorious safe blower and bank robber Sam Welsh. At the time of his arrest, Martin had a gold watch and $565 in cash believed to be his share of the spoils of the Missouri bank robbery. Martin was taken to the police court where he was measured, photographed and locked up while he awaited his transfer to Missouri. Omaha police arrested Jim Ling for operating an opium joint on June 3, 1898. The back of his mugshot lists his occupation as thief. Ling was described as 5 feet, 6 inches tall and weighing 104 pounds with black hair and hazel eyes. An unidentified member of the Omaha police force holds Herbert Cockran in a headlock during his mugshot. Cockran was arrested on Nov. 24, 1899, for burglary. A tailor from Fairmont, Nebraska, Cockran had a slightly stooped build with a fair complexion and his eyebrows met at the root of his nose, according to the police description. A double murder rocked the tiny town of Odessa, Buffalo County on the night of Dec. 4, 1899. Lillian Dinsmore was found dead in the kitchen of the house in which she and her charismatic husband Frank L. Dinsmore boarded. Fred Law, the boarding house owner, was shot in his bedroom. The Dinsmores had been married only a year. According to Fred Law's wife, Mr. Dinsmore became obsessed with her and seduced her. Unhappy in his marriage, Dinsmore supposedly plotted to kill his young wife and murder Law. After she was murdered, Lillian Dinsmore's brothers accused Dinsmore of using hypnotic powers on their vulnerable sister. After hearing the accusation, Mrs. Law also claimed to be a victim of Dinsmore's hypnotic influence. The Dinsmore case became a newspaper sensation. He vehemently denied all the charges even after the guilty verdict was read, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. Dinsmore's lawyers appealed the sentence and Governor Dietrich stepped in to commute his sentence to life in prison. Dinsmore posed for his mugshot at the Nebraska State Prison wearing a simple white cotton shirt, sack jacket, and striped prison-issue pants. Mrs. Adams was arrested in Omaha for blackmail. She listed her residence as Palisade, Nebraska, and her occupation as prostitute. The police record describes her as 5 feet, 1 inch tall with a medium build and a sallow complexion. Bert Martin was sentenced for stealing a horse in Keapaha County. At the prison, Bert worked in the broom factory. One day, Bert's cellmate of 11 months told the prison authorities a secret. Bert was really a woman named Lena Martin. In sparsely settled Keapaha County, Lena's masculine appearance allowed her to find work as a cowboy. Prison records show Martin was transferred to the women's division on Sept. 22, 1901. When Martin was sentenced, a woman, believed to be Martin's wife, stood beside him. Martin was sentenced to 2 years. The governor of Nebraska, Ezra P. Savage, said of her, "A sexual monstrosity, unfit for association with men or women, even in a penal institution," and on the solemn promise of its aged mother to care for it and guard it, and that prison morals imperatively demanded its removal. The sentence was commuted to 1 year, 6 months, Feb. 3, 1902. Nora Currier was better known as Red Nora. On March 31, 1901, Omaha police arrested Nora for stealing a horse. According to police court records, she was 22 years old and stood 5 feet, 3 inches tall. She had slate blue eyes and a scar on the center of her forehead. Robinson attempted to pay for a glass of beer in a Lower Douglas Street saloon in Omaha with a Mexican dollar on Nov. 21, 1901. The beer cost only a nickel and Robinson received 95 cents of American money in change. At the time, the foreign dollar looked very similar to the American currency but was only worth about 45 cents. This clever money scam left Robinson 50 cents and a glass of lager ahead of the game until he was arrested. George Leonard, an Omaha bookkeeper, was arrested for burglary on deck. 23, 1901. His large silk bow tie sits slightly askew against his stiffly collared shirt. Minnie Bradley refuses to look at the camera in her Omaha police court mugshot. Minnie, 27 and 52 inches, was arrested in Omaha for larceny from a person. She listed her residence on North 11th Street in Omaha, and her occupation as prostitute. The description also noted that Minnie wore a wig. Bertha Liebbeke earned the reputation of being one of the Midwest's most notorious pickpockets. She would search out a well-dressed man, ideally with a diamond-studded lapel pin. Bertha would then accidentally stumble into the helpless victim, pretending to faint in his arms. While he attempted to help her, Bertha would relieve the gentleman of his valuables or wallet. This trick earned her the nickname Fainting Bertha. Authorities from Illinois, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, and Nebraska knew Bertha and her tricks. Her aliases included Bertha Liebbeke, Jenny Jennings, Bertha Nixon, J. Armstrong, Carrie Jones, Bessie Mills, Minnie Swilson, and Bertha Siegel, the name on her Omaha police court mugshot. On Nov. 1, 1903, Elie Feazell disappeared from his farm southwest of Bostwick, Nebraska, about 15 miles east of Red Cloud. His housekeeper, Nanny Hutchinson, said he went to visit his son in Kansas City. Feazell's brother, Thomas, grew suspicious when inquiries found no trace of Elie. The investigation led to the arrest of the housekeeper and her 21-year-old son Charles. With little evidence that a crime had been committed, they were released after their hearing. The following spring, a Mr. Stanley began farming Elie Feazell's place. While working in a field, he found what appeared to be a newly opened grave. Upon close examination, authorities discovered a human hand, some hair from a man's head, part of a coat with an empty whiskey bottle in the pocket, and other pieces of clothing. Authorities believe Charles Hutchinson had seen Mr. Stanley plowing the field where the grave was later discovered. Charles began to act suspiciously. On May 6th, he rented a buggy he said was going to assist in taking the rig to Stark Ranch at Amboy, about 5 miles east. The next morning, Charles returned the rig to the livery stable in Red Cloud and paid the usual fee to Amboy. The team of horses used by Charles appeared to have had a longer drive than a trip to Amboy. Stable workers also noticed a terrible stench emanating from the rented buggy and cushions. They paid little attention to it until Mr. Stanley discovered the open grave in Elie Feazell's place. With the new evidence, authorities quickly rearrested Charles and his mother Nanny. Authorities believed that on the night Charles rented the buggy, he and his mother returned to the site where they had hidden Feazell's body in order to move the remains. The Hutchinsons had left telltale clues behind them, footprints of a man and woman corresponding to their shoe sizes. At trial, the Hutchinsons were found guilty of second-degree murder. On the evening of May 13, 1906, a violent confrontation occurred between the African-American members of Troop B, 10th United States Cavalry Regiment, and the townspeople of Crawford, Nebraska. A year before, Crawford Marshal Arthur Moss and Sergeant John Reid of Troop B had come close to blows after a July 4th horse race. The animosity between the two men continued. On the evening of May 13th, Moss was sent to break up a soldiers' beer party near the city park on the west edge of town. Moss ordered the party to quiet down or disperse. An altercation broke out between Moss, Reid, and PVT Jordan Taylor, also from Troop B. During the brief scuffle, Reid shot Moss with a .38 caliber revolver. Reid and Taylor fled into town and took refuge at the home of Edna Ewing, an elder black resident. While making their escape, the soldiers were followed and fired upon by several civilians. Art Moss died shortly after being shot. As a crowd gathered at the Ewing house, Taylor suddenly bolted and ran towards Fort Robinson. Before getting very far, he was fatally wounded. Reid was captured and taken under guard to the city jail. rumors spread through Crawford that solders from Fort Robinson had threatened to storm the jail and free Reid. City officials feared a civilian mob might seize and lynch the prisoner, so they decided to move Reid to the Chadron jail for safety. Before he could be transported, word came from the fort that several men and rifles from Troop B were missing. Colonel Auger quickly sent Troops I and K into town to prevent further violence. Soldier guards surrounded the jail. Tensions remained high into the next day. The 7 men who were reported absent from the B Troop barracks were placed in the post guardhouse, and 14 rifles were found concealed near the town limits. Reid was moved to the Chadron jail. He was eventually tried and convicted of manslaughter for the death of Arthur Moss, and sentenced to 7 years at the Nebraska State Prison. Alberto Intrisago was sentenced to 1 to 20 years at the Nebraska State Prison for assault to wound in February 1914. In the first photograph, Intrisago sports a thick mustache popularized by rebel leaders Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. The second set of mugshots shows Intrisago after his hair and mustache were shaved. Jenny Lester strikes a defiant pose in her mugshot. Lester was arrested in Phelps County for enticing to illicit intercourse in March 1914. She was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in the Nebraska State Prison. Thomas Whitney, known to his clients as the Professor, advertised extensively in Omaha newspapers as a clairvoyant, palmist, and astrologer. Whitney claimed he had no equal in giving advice on love, law, deeds, wills, mining, divorce, changes, investments, patents, and all other business of a financial nature. Readings cost only $1 for gentlemen and $.50 for ladies. One of his customers proved to be unsatisfied with the readings, and the professor was arrested for obtaining money under false pretenses in December 1915. According to the description on his mugshot, Whitney had tattoos on both of his arms. In November 1916, Schock was sentenced to 2 years at the Nebraska State Prison for grand larceny. According to his prison records, he enlisted in the United States Army shortly after his release in February 1918 to serve in World War I. Mattie Brown was sent to the Nebraska State Prison for 1 year for larceny from a person in Douglas County. Larceny of a person was often the legal term for the crime of pickpocketing. Nebraska's prohibition law went into effect on May 1, 1917, outlawing the manufacturing and sale of liquor. Soon after, Nebraska jails began filling with liquor law violators. William H. Lee was sentenced to 6 months to 2 years in the Nebraska State Prison for bootlegging in Hitchcock County in December 1919. Bootlegging is the illegal business of transporting alcoholic beverages. According to his official file, prison authorities granted Lee a furlough to visit his terminally ill wife. He returned to prison and was released on July 4, 1921. Lola Lopez wears a large gold locket in her Nebraska State Prison mugshot. In a moment of blind greed, her companion Cicerio Estrada clubbed, strangled, and robbed Stephen Pan in the Null rooming house in Sidney, Nebraska, on Jan. 9, 1922. Estrada and Lopez fled hours before the murder was discovered. They were captured in Greeley, Colorado, and were returned to Sidney to stand trial. Through an interpreter, the Mexican-born Lopez pleaded not guilty but did admit to having knowledge of the murder. She served 2 years, 2 months, and 22 days. Mary Shannon was sentenced to 2 years in the Nebraska State Prison for mayhem in May 1925. Her records do not explain what she did to be charged with mayhem. A legal definition of mayhem is the criminal act of disabling, disfiguring, or cutting off or making useless one of the members of another either intentionally or in a fight, called maiming. The serious nature of the injury makes mayhem a felony, which is called aggravated assault in most states. In February 1926, Frank Carter, dubbed the Omaha Sniper, terrorized the city of Omaha. He shot people at random, sometimes using a silencer on his pistol. Omaha newspapers recommended a blackout, as people were shot as they stood at their lighted windows. Carter brought Omaha to a standstill, with empty streets, for over a week. He was captured on Feb. 26 and tried for the murder of 2 people, but he claimed to have killed 43. His lawyers tried to plead insanity, but he was found guilty and executed by electrocution in June 1927. Carter's last words were reported to have been "Let the juice flow." Jake Voland attempted to steal chickens from Mr. and Mrs. Stubblefield. The Stubblefields, however, had devised an ingenious homemade burglar alarm to protect their large chicken farm in Gibbon. They placed a mousetrap near the door of the chicken barn that rang bells in both their living room and bedroom. Voland unknowingly set off the burglar alarm on a dark night in March 1931. The alleged thief ran out of the chicken house, refusing to stop when Mr. Stubblefield cried halt. In his attempt to flee the scene, the alleged thief dropped part of his booty and escaped with only 10 chickens at a value of over $5. In his haste, the burglar did not stop for his car and made his getaway on foot. Mr. Stubblefield parked near the abandoned car and notified the sheriff. The sheriff quickly determined the car belonged to Voland and proceeded to his home. Voland was placed under arrest despite his claims that the car was stolen by someone else for the purpose of the chicken house raid. The jury did not believe Voland's story. He was found guilty of theft and sentenced to 1 year in the Nebraska State Prison. James Pappa's mugshot card reads, "This man operated a general store in Dewey's, Nebraska, upon which he carried heavy insurance. He had a young man working for him and incited him to set fire to the store with the intention of collecting the insurance." Alv Little was sentenced to 12 minus 15 years in the Nebraska State Prison for bank robbery in Kearney County, Nebraska. Another man confessed to the crime and the state paid Little $2,500 for false imprisonment. He served 2 years and 7 days for a crime he did not commit. Ruby Fox and Myrtle Hetrick met while incarcerated at the State Reformatory for Women in York, Nebraska. Ruby was serving time for breaking and entering, and Myrtle for vagrancy. Unhappy with their treatment, Ruby and Myrtle engineered an escape. With the aid of an unnamed man, the 2 women fled Nebraska in an automobile. Authorities in Casper, Wyoming captured the fugitives. Upon their return to Nebraska, Ruby and Myrtle requested to go to the Nebraska State Prison rather than return to the Women's Reformatory in York. They received their wish and were sentenced to 1 year at the Nebraska State Prison for their escape. Amos Holloman was a repeat offender. Each time he entered the prison system, he was given a new number. These mugshots show how he aged.